Dr. Sa'd-ad-Din Ibrahim is an Egyptian-American sociologist and author.
Well, my childhood started in a village close to Mansoura, about 15, 16 kilometers from Mansoura. The village is called Biddin, and growing up in the village was a privilege because you grow up with fields around you, with greenery around you, with people who are very close to each other, intimate, almost like a family. At the time, the village was about 3,000 people living in it. A child growing up in that village can walk in any street, can walk into any house and feel at home. And therefore, it was a secure childhood, happy childhood, even though there was occasional hardships, especially when we began to go to the Kuttab al-Qarya or to memorize certain things. But all in all, when you look back into it, I think it was a happy childhood. And that lasted until the age of 8. And then after 8, I had to move to Mansoura, the closest city where there was more schooling that to be done, because the village only had about the first 3 years of schooling, and from 6 to 8, 6, 7, 8. And if any child or any villager or any family wanted for our children to go on, they have to move to a nearby town or city. And that was the case with our family. So there were already members of the family who had gone that route, and I followed suit. So I had 2 uncles who have gone that way, an older brother who also went that way. And therefore, the routine was fairly well known for the well-to-do families who wanted their children to have more education to move to the city. Moving to the city, Mansoura, was a fascinating experience for a villager, almost like going to Paris nowadays or to London. And there started a new phase in my life because I was away from my mother, from my father, only with an older brother or uncles, and that's not exactly like being with your parents. Also, you are seeing different things in the city, all kind of distractions, all kind of excitements, seeing movies for the first time, wanting to do the kind of things that urban children were used to, and I was not. So the first part of my experience in Mansoura at that very early age was a lot of fascination and distraction. Fascination and distraction that will cause me a bit of a shock midway when we got the school card and I was the last one in class. Class of 45, I was number 45. It shocked me, it saddened me, it challenged me. And that is, of course, reflecting back on that experience. And one of the painful moments would not only because I found out I was the last, even though my image as a child is that I was a good kid, in the Kuttab al-Qarya, in the compulsory school, Madrasa al-Ilzami, and all of a sudden you discover that you are the last in the class. So the shock, the disappointment challenged me. I started to study very hard. And came another very pleasant surprise that I became the first in the class. So the الفترة الأولى I was the last, الفترة الثانية I was the first. That was shocking to me a bit, but was also shocking to the school, to the class teacher, who happened to be, of course I still remember his name. Of all the teachers that I encountered, that particular one I remember very well. His name was Abu Zaid al-Gahlan, and he was the Arabic teacher, and he was as surprised to see that jump from 45 to number 1. I don't blame him because I myself was surprised. But he, I guess, in order to manage that surprise, he asked me to come out from my seat tahta to the blackboard and start dictating very hard words in Arabic. أمر أمير الأمراء بحفر بئر في الصحراء. A lot of words with hamzas in it. So I was bound to make a mistake, which I did. So sarcastically say, aha, and you are the first in the class, and you could not write this, and you could not. Open your hand, open my hand. He will hit me with a kharazana, and the class would laugh. So it turned that first pleasant experience into misery with that humiliation. In the tradition of that school is that the first of the class usually gets his picture or his photograph taken and put in an honors board in the schoolmaster's office. And having gone through that encounter, I began actually to suspect or to doubt myself whether I really deserved to be the first or not. So I did not go to the school master to get my picture taken and placed in the board. And I think he noted that there was one place empty, so he sent one of the aides to get me to find out why I didn't know that. When I went to the schoolmaster and he asked me, I broke down in tears. And he said, why are you crying? I said, well, because I really don't deserve to be the first of the class. He said, why? I said, that is what my teacher said, Al-Ustaz Abu Zaid al-Gahlan. When I kept, sobbing and crying, I was very, shall we say, very upset, very sad, a mixture of humiliation, anger. So he sat me down, and of course I remember him. His name was Mahmoud Amin Bek. On those days, a schoolmaster, even at the primary school level, was a Bek because there were fewer schools, not like now. And when you reach that point, you are called a Bek. So Mahmoud Amin Bek tapped me on the shoulder, sat me down, ordered hot chocolate. By that time we were in January, February, very cold. Got me hot chocolate, calmed me down. A true educator who turned a crisis situation for a child into a comforting encounter. And of course, I felt comforted. And he said, okay, after I finished my chocolate, hot chocolate, he said, now go out, get your picture taken, put it on the board. And that was happening. Now, that experience etched in my memory because throughout my life, every time I have a big achievement, I always have something that will almost like a jolt say it couldn't be true, too good to be true. That lasted with me until today. And you know, I had to do a lot of reflection. And it was only in prison some 50 years later that I could psychoanalyze myself to see why I felt that jolt every time I had a big achievement. Too good to be true.
He is one of Egypt's leading human rights and democracy activists and a strong critic of the former Egyptian regime.
So that is the childhood, and that was probably the highlight of those early years. I will go on with fewer surprises until I got to the secondary school. In secondary school, the highlight of that period was to discover my interest in public affairs, my excitement whenever there was a student demonstration, and much of the demonstrations at the time were against the occupation of the Suez Canal, and also against the King Farouk at the time, who was perceived as corrupt. And the whole regime was perceived by us as youngsters at that age. And then the revolution of 1952 took place. At that time, or by that time, I was 14. And like my generation, were very excited with the revolution. I happened to be an eyewitness to the scene of the departure of King Farouk from Alexandria. And the story was, every time, you know, like all children, when your family tries to encourage you to study harder, if you do well in school, we will take you to do this or we'll bring you this, promise you things. So the promise that year was that I will go to Alex to spend the summer. From a villager to go to Alex to see the sea, to spend the summer. And one of my uncles was living there. So the reward dangled in front of me was if I did well in school in that year, I will go to Alex to spend the summer, or at least part of the summer, with my cousins and with my uncle, who was an engineer living in Alexandria. Well, the day we were to go to Alexandria was the 23rd of July. By that time, people had took the train from Mansoura to Alexandria. So at that age, I was 14, listening to people in the train. Everybody had a theory of what happened the night before or the dawn of that day about the Harakat al-Jaysh, the army movement, and there are all kinds of theories that you are hearing from people in the train. I was excited, but just listening. I get to Alexandria. I found my uncle, who was colleagues of his, people of his generation, living in Alexandria or working with him, coming in the evening, talking about the same thing. So a continuation of what happened on the train, the conversation I was listening to, carried on in Alex by this middle class, shall we say, civil servants, government employees who were, let's say, in their 30s, 40s. So I was fascinated, a lot of interest in what was going on. And then we heard the Galal Maawad, another broadcaster, giving the announcement that the revolution, they did not call it a revolution at the time, Harakat al-Jaish, the free officers, have submitted an ultimatum to King Farouk to leave the country, to leave Alexandria at 6 o'clock on the 26th of July. I had already been in Alexandria for 3 days now. That was... So we got very excited. Everybody got excited. And the youngsters walked all the way from, at least the area where we were staying was called Bakus al-Raml. We walked all the way from that point where my uncle was living to Ras al-Tin, where the King Farouk was to depart the country. We saw him leaving the palace from a distance, of course, and wearing, white navy uniform and taking on to the Al-Mahrusa. Of course, we cheered when we saw him getting on the boat. We heard the 21-gun salute, and that was also, again, something that I will go back to, about how civil Egyptians were in even times of revolt and revolution. There was certain tradition they seem to have kept. So that was an exciting day in my life, a day that I will always remember in the tiniest of details. So that was the highlight of my teenage years up to that point. And then I will carry on. We will be introduced to Muhammad Naguib, the leader of that revolution or that movement, army movement, to Abdel Nasser, Gamal Abdel Nasser, to the writings of Abdel Nasser, which was assigned on us in high school. A book called Falsafat al-Thawra, the philosophy of the Egyptian revolution. And there was to be a contest on the school level, then on the district level, then on the national level in that book. Fascinated, reading, being very interested. I made it on the school level, then the district level of the Qahliya, and then on the national level. I was the first of nationally in that contest. The Minister of Education at the time was also a free officer by the name of Kamal al-Din Hussein. And he was very proud of that exercise of having all high school pupils study the revolution and having the contest in the revolution. So he took the top 10 to meet Abdel Nasser, which was also another very, very interesting encounter. So Abdel Nasser asked us, now that you have studied the revolution, he received us in the Revolutionary Command Council building in Al Jazeera, very close to Sheraton, Al Jazeera Sheraton, still standing. I think it's a museum now. Yes. Anyhow, we were met there, and he engaged us after, greeting us. And he said, all right, now you study the revolution. And by the level you go to the national level, you study not only the Egyptian revolution, but also other revolutions, comparative kind of framework. So he said, I want to know from you what distinguishes the Egyptian revolution. And what a beautiful girl among us. And of course, as teenagers, we were all flirting with her. And she looked at me as if commanding me to answer. عينيها كده قالت لي مش طالع الأول علينا يعني. You are the first. Answer. Of course, she didn't say that in words, but at least I felt as if I was getting that command. So I said, the Egyptian revolution was distinguished by, he interrupted me, and he said, isn't was a past tense? مش كانت دي فعل ماضي? He made that interruption or that comment, I froze. Didn't know what to say. I stopped. So he said, what's your name? The other 9, all in one voice. Saad al-Din Ibrahim, ya Rais. So in my memoirs, when I wrote about that encounter, I said if Darwin says that man was originally an ape, Egyptians were originally informers, مخبرين. ما هو ال9 زملائك كلهم مرة واحدة they were ready to inform. Abdel Nasser was kind. He tapped him on the shoulder because when I froze, he asked about my name. He heard what my name was. He said, كمل يا سعد الدين أو يا سعد. I tried to carry on the rest of the answer very carefully, trying to search for words, not because the minister's face was red, flustered, next to Abdel Nasser. So I couldn't avoid seeing both faces. So I had to be very, very, very careful, try to be very careful. Trying to couch every word with a qualifier, and I said, of course, the revolution had to resort to violence to protect itself against its enemies, against the counter-revolutionaries. So occasionally it made some brutal action. He said, oh, brutal action? Like what? He asked. So I said, like hanging workers in Kafr Dawar or torturing Muslim brothers in prison. He said, is that hearsay or do you know anything firsthand? So I said, no, I know at least one thing firsthand. One of my classmates, and I began to tell him a story about a classmate who was a little bit older than we were, had no interest in politics at all, but he was arrested by mistake as being a Muslim brother. In 1954, there was an attempt on Nasser's life in Manshia and Alexandria, was followed immediately by mass arrest of the Muslim brothers. And one of the youngsters arrested was that fellow by the name of Abdul Hamid Hassanin, and he had no interest in politics at all. As a matter of fact, and he was 3 or 4 years older because he used to flunk a lot. And the flunkies have no interest in public affairs. They have interest in smoking, in girls, all this and that. But he was a, shall we say, an attractive kid. Attractive. That's just like any naughty kid. دمه خفيف ومهرج. So in that sense, we all liked him, even though as I said, he was older than we were. But the sad part is that when he was arrested, and because he had no interest whatsoever in politics, he got tortured. He to make a confession of his membership in the Muslim Brothers, and he was not a Muslim brother. So he was repeatedly tortured until he lost his mind. The other sad part is that his mother used to come and stand by the school and cry every morning, seeing, his classmates coming and going was a very sad scene. And so I mentioned all of this in front of Abdul Nasser. Abdul Nasser began to take notes midway as I was talking. And then, after I finished the story of Abdul Hamid and of the Kafr Dawar before it, and there was silence, everybody's silence. He broke that silence by saying, do you see this fountain pen? This is a fountain pen that I got as a gift from the American President Dwight Eisenhower. And as students in the military academy, and later on في كلية الأركان in the staff academy, we learned a lot about Eisenhower, not as an American president, but as a military commander in the Second World War, as the commander of the Western Front, Normandy, the crossing, and the last battle that settled the Second World War. So that fountain pen I value very much. And the story is, he was telling really a joke, trying to break the silence and the kind of rather depressive moment. He said, the story is that I lost that pen. So I called the Minister of the Interior, Zakaria Muhyiddin, and I said, Zakaria, the fountain pen that I got as a gift from President Eisenhower is missing. So please search for it. He said, a few minutes later, I was getting a file from a drawer. I found the pen. I was happy to find the pen. So again, still continuation of the story or the joke that he was telling these youngsters. So I called Zakaria Muhyiddin, the Minister of the Interior, again, 5 minutes later, to tell him not to look, not to search for the pen, because I found it. He said, how could you, Mr. President? We already arrested the thief, and he had already confessed his crime. So we broke into laughter. And that, to me, was again the ability of a charismatic leader to command a situation, to turn a depression or a drama into something comical. Controlling the audience was something that I discovered very early on. Anyhow, he was taking notes. So the rest of the story is that by the time I get back to my village, that kid was released from the mental hospital and was a governor, who was called at the time the Mudir al-Mudiriya, taken in the governor's car back to the village, and with a big chocolate box and an envelope from Abdel Nasser, and with 100 pounds in it, to the mother of Abdul Hamid Hassani. And that story, of course, made it all over the village, the governorate, and it touched me deeply, of course, that he would take an interest in what I was saying, that he will correct a mistake.
Dr. Saadeddin Ibrahim has earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Cairo in 1960 and completed his doctorate at the University of Washington in 1968 in sociology. He has more than 30 authored and edited books and more than 100 scholarly articles.
First of all, in secondary school, again studying hard, that still image of wanting ahead. And I chose to be in the social science, literally بسموه الآداب يعني الأدبي, and I was one of the top 10 in the country. So I had a grades that enabled me to go to several colleges, and I did, having that top grade and being one of the top 10, I was able to actually scout and test, go to different colleges in that first few weeks of the academic year. So I did Tigara, I did حقوق, law, business, and then in the Faculty of Arts, كلية الآداب, has many departments. So I was also able to move from one department to another, just test whether I would like the subject, would like the teachers, until I ended up in the sociology department of Cairo University, of كلية الآداب يعني, Faculty of Arts. And it was a huge class. My دفعة يعني, my class was almost 2,000 people in that department. And so the competition again was very tough, because 3 of the top ثانوية عامة were classmates in that department, which was very unusual to have 3, الرابع والسادس والسابع, all in the same department. So, as you could imagine, it was a very tough competition throughout the 4 years. Second year, once you get certain grades, you get into something called the honor section. And the honor section, you and one of the professors directly. So beside the general classes that you take with these 2,000 students, the top 3 or 4, whoever gets a high mark, like جيد جدا أو امتياز, they are in an honor class. And that honor class, you have 2 additional courses every semester with a professor. Well, I made it. Again, I graduated at the top in my class, الأول يعني. And الأول becomes a معيد, an instructor. And on those days, it was a very privileged thing to be a معيد, because you know the track, you become a معيد, you get your master's, your PhD, you become a faculty member, مدرس, أستاذ مساعد. And on those days, meritocracy was the most important thing, is that everybody gets an equal opportunity based on his ability, on his grades. These were part of the ethos of the 1952 revolution. العدالة التوزيعية, العدالة الاجتماعية, الجدارة, and so on. Anyhow, when it was a time to deliver the graduating certificate, was something called Eid al-Ilm. And it was Nasr again. And as I called on my name to get to the podium where Nasr was, to get my diploma, I was stunned by his observation. He said, "How is Abdul Hamid Hassanin?" I nearly broke into tears. Why? Because here is a man who is president of a country, who had gone through all kind of crises, from fighting or resisting the British, to fighting the Suez War, to nationalizing all kind of things, to resisting the big powers, America, Al-Ahlaf, the foreign pacts and so on, to trying to lead the country and the Arab world into something of its own, to go into Bandung, non-alignment, going through a lot of battles. And he would remember a small incident. To me, but in retrospect, it was a small incident. But it seemed to have left, obviously, it's left a mark. So that cemented my admiration of the man and my love for him and for the revolution of 1952. And therefore, when I got a scholarship to study abroad, I would become, as a student activist, forget to say that while I was in Cairo University, I was also the head of the student union in my college, which is, again, was a bit unusual because students don't get involved in student politics or student activity. But I was determined to live my life fully, not only to study well, but also to be involved in public affairs, not to neglect my romantic life. All of that, I tried to live life fully. And so I get the scholarship. And during those days, I had again to recognize women who changed my life. And one of them, not only my mother, but also the dean of one of the colleges, كلية البنات, كان اسمها فتحية سليمان. She was the dean of the college, girls' college in Ain Shams University. And even though I was a Mu'id in Cairo University, but when you get a scholarship, it was announced nationwide and it could be in any college, any place. So I got a scholarship to go to France to get my PhD. However, in that year, the war of national liberation in Algeria reached a high point, and France did something brutal vis-a-vis the Algerians that required Nasser and other Arab leaders to take a very tough stand vis-a-vis France. And one of this was to break diplomatic relations with France in 1950. This would be in 1960, 62. So my scholarship to France was diverted to an internal scholarship to get my PhD here in Cairo. And that, of course, upset me because I was the first on the country in my field. And yet, the second and third, one went to England and another one went to Germany. And here I am, the first, who, instead of going to France, I was to stay in Egypt and study English. I went to the dean of the college to tell her about this development, and she was very upset. And she said, sit down. I sat down, and I did not know, shouting, how could you divert that scholarship from France to local scholarship without consulting with us? We are the ones who own that scholarship, that faculty, girls, Ain Shams University, Ain Shams. And I don't know who was on the other line, what transpired, but after 2 or 3 minutes of this conversation with the guy on the other line, she commanded me to go back to the missions department in Mabna al-Mugamma in Tahrir and to ask for a particular person who was in charge. Oh, she asked me, would you like to go to America instead? I said, yes. She said, okay, you will go to America. I said, go to America? You know, that simply? May I ask, very timidly, because she was a dean, whom are you talking to? She said, I was talking to the Minister of Higher Education. I said, calling him by his first name and shouting at him? He said, yes. He's my husband. So she was calling her husband, who happened to be Dr. Abdulaziz Sayed. See the names I mentioned in this program. I mentioned them, or I remember them by the name of the thousands of people I encountered in my life because of the turning points that each one had in his or her own way. So that was Fathiya Suleiman, the dean of the girls' college, calling Abdulaziz on the phone, who happened to be the Minister of Higher Education, Wazir al-Ta'lim al-Ali, shouting at him, getting his approval that the mission, the scholarship is not from France to Egypt back to America. And I did go to mission department. I finished the work in just few hours, few days, and I was ready to travel to America.
Saad ad-Din is the founder of both the Ibn Khaldun Center for Development Studies in Cairo and the Arab Organization for Human Rights.
Well, I had worked in research centers, both here in Egypt, the National Center for Sociological and Criminological Research in Mbaba. I also worked in Al-Ahram Center for Strategic Studies, in the Arab Center, or the Center for Arab Unity Studies in Beirut, and the Arab Thought Forum in Amman, along with brief work in Iraq. So I had experiences working in research centers, both in Egypt as well as in the Arab world. And I noted that none of these centers was free, independent. And therefore, I dreamt of creating a private, free, independent research center. The family owns a villa in Muqattam, and then I got a big award called the Kuwait Award in Social and Economic Sciences, which is about a $1 million award. So without $1 million award, and with a building that the family owns in Muqattam, I thought this is opportunity then to use this money and this building to create a free, independent social science research building. And that was Ibn Khaldun. Why Ibn Khaldun? Because Ibn Khaldun was an activist in his own time. He's a 14th century Arab Muslim thinker, but he was also a rebel. He was an activist. He advised many of the kings and rulers in his time, but he got into trouble with each one of them and kept moving from one country to the other. But he was a brilliant social scientist. He is a founder of the Arab social sciences. And therefore, I thought I will name that center after him to commemorate him, to recognize him, to get people to learn more about him, but also to function as an independent forum for doing social research and for advocacy. So we spent the first 3-4 years of the center building database, building information, knowledge about Egypt and the Arab world. And the next 3 years, we began to talk, to advocate some of the new values that we believed in. Democracy, civil society. We introduced these terms, civil society, transparency, to the Arabic language and to the Egyptian political discourse. The word civil society had never existed in the Egyptian vocabulary until we created that center. And our publication, monthly publication, is called Civil Society, Al-Mujtama al-Madani. So our goal was to build civil society and to push for democratic transformation. So when you see the newsletter, the magazine, or the annual report, that is the title. Civil Society, subtitle, Democratic Transformation of the Arab World.
Dr. Ibrahim is married to Barbara Lethem Ibrahim, director of the Ghada Center in Cairo.
She was a student in the university I taught in, and she happened to be one of the things that my mother had asked me not to do, to promise her before I left Egypt to America, was not to marry a foreigner or an American. So I kept that promise to my mother. Having gone through what I just said, I had reached by the age of 31, or 30 actually, without being married. My mother was a bit uneasy about having reached that age. But I was still very loyal to the promise, to the pledge I made to her of not marrying an American. It happened that I told you about the 60s, all kind of movements, radical movements on American campuses and so on. One of those radical movements was an anti-marriage movement. حركة مناهضة الزواج. And on campus, every club has to have a faculty advisor. عضو من هيئة التدريس يعني. So they looked for a faculty advisor. They came to me. I said, حركة مناهضة الزواج. طيب, does this mean you don't go out? He said, no, go out and everything. But we just are against marriage. Why? Because the institution, it limits freedom. It is a failure. It is boring. They have their arguments. Being the radical, professor on campus. I said, fine, I'll be your advisor. So I became the advisor of that club. The head of that club, or the head of that association, happened to be this lady that you saw. So at one time, just chatting, she said, why are you against marriage? We are against marriage for, they have reasons that I mentioned, oppressive institution, limiting, lack of freedom, and so on. I said, well, I'm not against marriage in principle. I'm just against marrying an American woman. I said, what? That is discrimination in reverse. That is racism. And you are posing like a radical professor? I'm going to expose you. كلمة exposing someone in those days هفضحك يعني. يا ستي طب اهدي بس اهدي. Calm down. It is not racism. It is not discrimination. It's just because I come from a very underdeveloped country. And that underdeveloped country has an American woman could not really survive in it. She said, is that the reason? I said, yes. Is that the only reason? I said, yes. I was lying. Second time. I don't want to tell her my mother said this or that. But so she listened, half probably believing, half doubting, until she graduated. And we said goodbye, and we will keep in touch. And she left. You know, in America, very few students study in their hometowns. They study usually in a different state, a different town, and so on. So that was a goodbye upon her graduation. A month later, we had agreed that we'll stay in touch. I was calling to see how she's doing. Her mother said, oh, don't you know where she is? I said, no. Where is she? She said, she is on her way to Egypt. I said, what? Egypt? Whom does she know in Egypt? She said, oh, she had all the telephone numbers of your friends, of your relatives, of your family, from other students who had gone to Egypt. Because on those days, every student had to spend a year abroad. So some of them who spent time in the Middle East stopped in Egypt, met my family, had pictures, telephone numbers, and so on. Anyhow, so I called my family. I told them that there will be a girl descending on them, and she had very romantic, unrealistic ideas about Egypt. So please show her the worst sides of Egypt. A month later, she came back, and we had a conversation. I said, now you know, you have seen how underdeveloped and how backward my country is, how difficult it is. I said, no, I loved your country. I can live in your country. The question is whether you, having been in America for now nearly 10 years, as a student and then as a faculty member, I wonder whether you could live in your own country. I can live there. I lived there for a month, and I know I can live there. Very challenging. And then I began to get letters from my mother, from my relatives, telling me, if this girl would agree to marry her, we loved her, we enjoyed her, we think she would be a wonderful wife, if only she could agree. With your old age, at that time we were 10 years apart. She was younger, 31, and she was barely 21. So I felt that the circle was and also my friends, my colleagues, and America as well, they all loved her, liked her. So she being against marriage, I am against marriage. So I agreed on a marriage for 1 year, testing. And that was initial contract. We will marry for 1 year. After that 1 year, she said, well, she is willing to renew it for another year or to extend it for another year if I am ready. I agreed. Second year of extension, she got pregnant. At that time, we were in Beirut. I couldn't come still to Egypt. So I used to come close to the area, either in Beirut, Amman, Morocco, Algeria, whatever, and my family would come to see me. By that time, got married, went to Beirut, and she got pregnant. It was then sealed with that first pregnancy and child born in Beirut, a lovely daughter. We no longer talked about renewal, but how to sustain the marriage.